September 3, 1952. The heroin trade in Harlem was entering a period of violent transformation that would reshape New York City's drug economy for the next 2 decades. What had been primarily a localized operation controlled by various Italian mob families and independent black operators was about to encounter competition from an unexpected source. Mexican organized crime that had been building distribution networks along the southwestern border and was now expanding operations into major East Coast cities where demand was growing faster than traditional suppliers could accommodate. Bumpy Johnson had been observing this transformation with the analytical attention he applied to any significant change in Harlem's criminal economy. At 56 years old, he'd survived 3 decades in organized crime by understanding that adaptation was more valuable than resistance when fundamental market forces were shifting in ways that couldn't be stopped through violence alone. The heroin trade was different from the numbers racket or policy operations that Bumpy had built his empire around. Heroin was more profitable per transaction, but also more dangerous legally, more destructive to the communities where it was sold, and more likely to attract federal attention that could dismantle entire organizations. Bumpy had deliberately kept his own organization's involvement in heroin limited to taxation rather than direct distribution. He allowed various operators to sell heroin in Harlem as long as they paid appropriate percentages and followed rules designed to minimize the most visible damage. No sales to children, no operations within 2 blocks of schools or churches, no violence that attracted media attention. This approach generated steady revenue without exposing Bumpy to the kind of legal liability that would eventually destroy many of his competitors who chose more aggressive involvement in narcotics trafficking. But the arrival of the Sinaloa organization in September 1952 threatened to disrupt the careful equilibrium that Bumpy had maintained. The Sinaloa cartel wasn't a traditional crime family in the Italian or Irish model. It was a business enterprise that happened to operate illegally, with supply chains that extended from opium cultivation in Mexico's Sierra Madre Mountains through processing facilities that converted raw opium into heroin of purity levels that existing suppliers couldn't match, and distribution networks that could deliver product to East Coast cities at prices that undercut established operators by 20 to 30%. The first indication that Sinaloa was entering Harlem came on September 3rd, when 3 Mexican men were observed conducting surveillance of known heroin distribution points in the neighborhood. These weren't street-level dealers or low-ranking enforcers. They were professional operatives conducting methodical intelligence gathering, photographing locations, documenting patterns, identifying vulnerabilities in existing distribution networks. They were observed by Bumpy's own intelligence network, reported immediately, and within 6 hours, Bumpy had identified who they worked for and what their presence signaled. Rafael El Zorro Mendoza was the Sinaloa organization's primary representative for East Coast expansion. At 41 years old, Mendoza had built his reputation by successfully establishing distribution operations in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Chicago, through combination of competitive pricing, reliable supply, and strategic violence against operators who refused to accommodate the new competitor in their markets. Mendoza's nickname, the Fox, came from his preferred approach to business conflicts. He would rather outmaneuver opponents than fight them directly. But when fighting became necessary, he was ruthlessly effective at eliminating resistance. Mendoza's presence in New York was confirmed on September 7th, when he attended a meeting with several Italian mobsters who controlled heroin distribution in parts of Brooklyn and Lower Manhattan. The meeting was observed by Marcus Webb, who'd been tracking Mendoza since his arrival, and who reported to Bumpy that the Mexicans were offering product at prices 40% below what Italian suppliers charged, with purity levels that were significantly higher than what was currently available in New York's market. This was classic market disruption. Offer better product at lower prices, force existing suppliers to either match terms they couldn't sustain or lose market share to the new competitor. The Italian family's response was predictable. On September 11th, 2 Mexican distributors who'd been establishing connections in Brooklyn were found dead in circumstances that made clear this was execution rather than robbery. The message was equally clear. Sinaloa's attempt to enter New York's heroin market was being met with violence designed to discourage further expansion. This was the traditional approach to dealing with new competitors, the method that organized crime had used successfully for decades to maintain territorial control and prevent outsiders from establishing operations. But Rafael Mendoza's response to this violence was not traditional. Rather than escalating with retaliatory killings that would have initiated a war neither side could win cleanly, Mendoza sent a message to every significant heroin distributor in New York, including those operating in Harlem. The product we offer is superior. The prices we offer are better. The violence being directed at us demonstrates fear rather than strength. We are not leaving. We are expanding. You can resist and die, or you can profit from what we provide. Choose wisely. This message reached Bumpy Johnson on September 14th through multiple channels, delivered by distributors who operated in Harlem and who were nervous about what was coming. They understood that war between Sinaloa and the Italian families would destroy the stable environment that allowed everyone to operate profitably. War meant police attention, federal investigation, unpredictable violence that killed bystanders, and attracted media coverage that made politicians demand crackdowns. War was expensive and destabilizing, and most people in the heroin trade would prefer to avoid it if possible. Bumpy called a meeting for September 17th at Small's Paradise, inviting every significant heroin distributor who operated in Harlem along with representatives from the Italian families who controlled adjacent territories. The meeting was designed to discuss response to the Sinaloa incursion, to coordinate resistance, to demonstrate unified opposition to outside competition. Bumpy's reputation as someone who could mediate between different factions made him natural choice to convene such meeting, and his invitation was accepted by everyone involved because refusing would have signaled weakness. What nobody at that meeting expected, what would later be described as the most shocking business decision of Bumpy Johnson's criminal career, was that Bumpy had also invited Rafael Mendoza to attend. When Mendoza walked into Small's Paradise at 8:47 p.m. on September 17th, accompanied by two associates, and walking directly to the table where Bumpy sat, the reaction from the other attendees was immediate and hostile. Several Italian representatives stood as if preparing to leave or fight. Multiple hands moved toward weapons. The atmosphere in the room transformed instantly from tense negotiation to potential massacre. Bumpy remained seated, his voice calm when he spoke. Everyone sits down. Everyone stays calm. Mr. Mendoza is here because I invited him. He's here because I believe we can resolve this situation in ways that benefit everyone involved rather than destroying value through a war nobody really wants to fight. The room remained tense, but violence was averted as people slowly returned to their seats. Understanding that Bumpy wouldn't have arranged this meeting without having thought through implications and consequences, Bumpy's next words would define the heroin trade in Harlem for the next decade, and would establish a template for how different criminal organizations could cooperate rather than compete destructively. The Sinaloa organization has better product at better prices, Bumpy said, stating facts that everyone present already understood. They have supply chains that we can't match, and production capabilities that give them advantages we can't overcome through violence or territorial control. The Italian families have established distribution networks and political connections that would take years for outsiders to replicate. We have community relationships and operational security that neither the Italians nor the Mexicans can duplicate. Everyone at this table has something valuable. The question is whether we destroy that value fighting each other, or whether we find a way to combine our advantages and all profit more than we would separately. Rafael Mendoza spoke for the first time since entering the room. Mr. Johnson is correct. We came to New York expecting to fight for market access. We were prepared for violence. But Mr. Johnson has suggested an alternative that I believe serves everyone's interests better than war. We provide product at wholesale prices that allow everyone to maintain their margins. You provide distribution through established networks. We split revenue according to contribution. Nobody's territory is invaded. Nobody's operations are disrupted. Everyone makes more money than they make currently, and nobody dies in a war that would eventually attract federal attention that destroys all our businesses. The proposal was elegant in its simplicity and revolutionary in its implications. Traditional organized crime operated on territorial control. You defended your territory against invasion. You fought competitors who tried to establish operations in your area. You maintained power through demonstrated willingness to use violence. What Bumpy was proposing was different. Cooperative arrangement, where different organizations contributed different capabilities and shared resulting profits, rather than competing destructively for market share. The Italian representatives were skeptical, accustomed to viewing any incursion into their territories as existential threat that had to be met with violence. But the mathematics of Bumpy's proposal were compelling. Sinaloa's heroin was 40% cheaper and significantly more pure than what Italian suppliers currently provided. Distributors who could access that product while maintaining their existing networks would see profit margins that were double or triple what they currently earned. The alternative was war that would cost money, attract attention, and might result in Sinaloa eventually winning through sheer determination and superior product quality. The discussion that followed over the next 3 hours was detailed, occasionally heated, but ultimately productive. Terms were negotiated, percentages were calculated, territorial boundaries were defined not as areas to be defended violently, but as distribution zones where different organizations would maintain operational control while sourcing product from Sinaloa's supply chain. By midnight on September 17, 1952, an agreement had been reached that would transform New York's heroin trade from a fragmented, violently competitive market into a coordinated operation that generated unprecedented profits while maintaining the kind of stability that allowed everyone to operate with reduced risk of law enforcement interference. The alliance shocked everyone who learned about it. Bumpy Johnson, who'd built his reputation partially on resistance to outside control and on protecting Harlem from exploitation by outsiders, had just formed partnership with Mexican Cartel that had been attempting to invade his territory. Italian families who'd killed 2 Sinaloa distributors just days earlier were now agreeing to source product from the same organization. Everyone involved was cooperating with people they'd been prepared to go to war against, and they were doing it because the mathematics of cooperation were more compelling than the traditional logic of territorial conflict. The implementation of what became known as the Harlem Accord began on September 23, 1952, 6 days after the meeting at Small's Paradise, where Bumpy Johnson had brokered the alliance that shocked everyone involved in New York's heroin trade. The first shipment of Sinaloa product arrived in Brooklyn at a warehouse controlled by the Genovese family, delivered by Rafael Mendoza's organization, with the kind of professional logistics that demonstrated why Mexican cartels were becoming dominant forces in North American drug trafficking. The shipment contained 50 kilograms of heroin with purity levels averaging 87%, significantly higher than the 40 to 50% purity that had been standard for heroin available in New York through traditional Italian supply chains. The difference in purity translated directly to profit. The same amount of heroin could be cut and distributed to generate nearly double the doses that existing product would produce, which meant distributors could maintain their retail prices while effectively reducing their costs by almost half. The mathematics were irresistible to everyone involved in the trade. Marcus Webb supervised the quality testing and initial distribution on behalf of Bumpy's organization, working with chemists who confirmed that Sinaloa's product was not only more pure, but also more consistent in quality than what existing suppliers provided. Consistency mattered in drug distribution, because customers developed tolerance based on purity levels, and inconsistent product led to overdoses, when users who'd adapted to lower purity suddenly received higher concentrations than their systems could handle. Sinaloa's quality control meant fewer overdose deaths, which translated to less police attention and more sustainable customer base. The financial arrangements that Bumpy had negotiated were structured to benefit all parties proportionally to their contributions. Sinaloa received 40% of gross revenue from all heroin sales in territories covered by the agreement. This compensated them for production costs, transportation risk, and the superior quality of product they provided. Italian families who controlled distribution networks received 30%, reflecting their established infrastructure and political connections that provided protection from law enforcement interference. Bumpy's organization received 20% for providing access to Harlem's market, maintaining community relations that prevented the kind of resistance that could disrupt operations, and serving as mediator between parties who didn't traditionally cooperate. The remaining 10% was distributed among street-level dealers who handled actual transactions. By October 15, 1952, less than a month after the alliance was formalized, everyone involved was generating revenue that exceeded what they'd earned previously by margins that ranged from 60 to 90%. Sinaloa was moving product through established networks that would have taken them years to build independently. Italian families were selling superior product at competitive prices without the supply chain vulnerabilities that had previously limited their operations. Bumpy was collecting taxes on an expanded trade without additional enforcement costs or increased exposure to legal prosecution. The cooperation was proving more profitable than competition had ever been. But the alliance created shockwaves that extended far beyond the immediate participants. Other criminal organizations that weren't included in the arrangement found themselves unable to compete with distributors who had access to better product at better prices. Independent operators who'd been selling heroin in Harlem were forced to either join the arrangement by paying appropriate percentages to Bumpy or exit the trade entirely because they couldn't match the quality and pricing that the alliance provided. Several chose to exit, understanding that trying to compete against coordinated operations with superior supply chains was economically futile. The law enforcement response to the alliance was complicated by the fact that cooperation between different criminal organizations made investigation more difficult rather than easier. Traditional organized crime investigations relied on exploiting conflicts between rival groups, using informants from one organization to gather evidence against another, leveraging the violence that accompanied territorial disputes to justify aggressive prosecution. When different organizations cooperated rather than competed, many of these investigative approaches became less effective. The FBI's Organized Crime Division began tracking the alliance in November 1952, but struggled to gather actionable intelligence because the reduced violence and increased efficiency that cooperation produced actually made the operation harder to penetrate. Federal Bureau of Narcotics agent Thomas McCarthy, who'd been investigating heroin trafficking in Harlem since 1949, recognized that the alliance represented significant evolution in how organized crime operated. In a report dated December 8, 1952, McCarthy wrote, "Traditional enforcement approaches that rely on exploiting conflicts between criminal organizations are less effective against coordinated operations where different groups cooperate for mutual profit. The Harlem heroin trade has become more sophisticated, more efficient, and paradoxically more difficult to disrupt, precisely because the violence and conflict that usually accompanies drug trafficking has been replaced by business arrangements that function like legitimate corporate partnerships." The community impact of the alliance was equally complex. Harlem residents who'd been dealing with the violence and instability that characterized the heroin trade during the previous decade noticed that the alliance period brought reduced street-level conflict. Dealers weren't fighting over territory because territories had been clearly defined and were respected by all parties. Customers weren't being victimized by inconsistent product quality because Sinaloa's supply chain delivered consistent heroin that reduced overdose deaths. The trade was still devastating to individuals and families affected by addiction, but the alliance had paradoxically made that devastation more organized and less chaotic. Bumpy's role in the alliance generated mixed reactions within Harlem's black community. Some viewed his cooperation with Mexican cartels as a pragmatic business decision that maintained his influence while adapting to changing market realities. Others saw it as betrayal of the community protection that Bumpy had previously provided, arguing that facilitating heroin distribution, even in more organized form, was fundamentally at odds with claims of protecting Harlem from outside exploitation. Bumpy never publicly defended or explained the alliance, operating with the understanding that his decisions would be judged by results rather than by explanations. The financial scale of the alliance became clear by early 1953. During the first 6 months of operation, the coordinated heroin trade generated approximately $8.7 million in gross revenue across all territories covered by the agreement. Bumpy's 20% share translated to approximately $174 million, which represented more income than his organization had generated from all other operations combined during the same period. The alliance had transformed heroin from peripheral element of Bumpy's criminal enterprise into its most profitable component. But the alliance also created dependencies that concerned Bumpy's more strategic advisors. Marcus Webb argued in a private conversation in February 1953 that relying on Sinaloa for product supply gave the Mexican cartel leverage that could become problematic if relationships deteriorated. If Sinaloa decided to change terms or withdraw from the arrangement, everyone dependent on their supply chain would face significant disruption. Bumpy acknowledged this concern, but argued that the same mutual dependency that made everyone vulnerable also made everyone invested in maintaining cooperation. Sinaloa needed the distribution networks that the alliance provided as much as distributors needed Sinaloa's product. The alliance's structure was tested in March 1953, when a dispute emerged over territorial boundaries in the Bronx. A Genovese family distributor had been operating in an area that another crew claimed as their exclusive territory, and the dispute threatened to escalate into violence that would have undermined the cooperative arrangement. Bumpy mediated the conflict by bringing both parties together and enforcing the original territorial agreements that had been negotiated 6 months earlier. The dispute was resolved without violence, and the resolution reinforced Bumpy's position as neutral arbiter whose authority extended across different criminal organizations. Rafael Mendoza returned to New York in April 1953 for a review meeting with all Alliance participants. The meeting's purpose was to assess the first 6 months of operation and to make adjustments to terms if necessary based on actual experience. Mendoza arrived with detailed financial accounting that demonstrated Sinaloa had delivered product consistently and at the quality levels promised, and he argued that the 40% share Sinaloa received was actually lower than market value given the superior product they provided. But Mendoza also acknowledged that the Alliance had exceeded his organization's expectations for how quickly they could establish profitable East Coast operations, and he proposed extending the arrangement for another 2 years, with minor adjustments to percentage distributions. The negotiations that followed resulted in revised terms that gave Sinaloa an additional 2 percentage points, offset by reduced percentages across other participants. The adjustment was small enough that everyone's actual revenue continued increasing due to growing market, but significant enough that it acknowledged Sinaloa's leverage as exclusive supplier of the product that made the entire arrangement profitable. Bumpy's role in negotiating these revisions reinforced his position as essential intermediary, whose ability to maintain cooperation between parties who didn't naturally trust each other had concrete economic value. By summer 1953, the Alliance had become so successful that other criminal organizations in different cities began attempting to replicate the model. Mexican cartels working with Italian families and black operators in Philadelphia, Detroit, and Cleveland established similar cooperative arrangements, using the Harlem Accord as template for how different groups could coordinate rather than compete. The spread of this model represented fundamental shift in how organized crime operated, from territorial competition enforced through violence to market coordination based on comparative advantages and profit sharing. The FBI's response to this evolution was to increase resources dedicated to narcotics enforcement and to develop new investigative techniques that focused on financial tracking, rather than relying primarily on informants and violence-based interventions. Federal agents began analyzing cash flows, identifying banking patterns, and building cases based on financial evidence rather than testimony from criminal participants. This shift in enforcement approach would eventually become standard practice in organized crime investigation, but in 1953 it represented adaptation to the reality that criminal organizations were becoming more sophisticated and cooperative. The long-term consequences of Bumpy's alliance with Sinaloa extended far beyond immediate financial gains. The cooperation demonstrated that criminal organizations could coordinate across ethnic and geographic boundaries when mutual profit incentivized cooperation over competition. This realization would influence how organized crime operated for decades, with cartels and crime families increasingly working together, rather than engaging in the kind of destructive territorial wars that had characterized earlier periods. The violence didn't disappear entirely. Enforcement of agreements still required credible threat of force, but it became more targeted and less frequent than during periods when every interaction between different criminal organizations was potentially hostile. The alliance also had unintended consequences for Bumpy's legacy within Harlem. While he remained respected for his business acumen and his ability to maintain influence in changing environment, the cooperation with heroin trafficking that the alliance represented became part of more complicated assessment of his impact on the community. Bumpy had protected Harlem from some forms of exploitation while facilitating others, had maintained order while profiting from activity that destroyed lives, had demonstrated business genius while applying that genius to trade that many viewed as fundamentally immoral, regardless of how efficiently it was conducted. When Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, 16 years after establishing the alliance with Sinaloa, the cooperative arrangement he'd helped create was still functioning in modified form. The specific organizations involved had changed. Sinaloa had been replaced by other Mexican cartels, Italian families had been weakened by prosecution, new groups had entered the trade. But the basic model of coordination rather than competition remained template for how heroin distribution functioned in major American cities. The alliance had proven more durable than any individual participant, surviving personnel changes and law enforcement pressure, because the economic logic that made cooperation more profitable than conflict remained valid regardless of who was implementing it. The final assessment of the alliance depends on perspective. From business standpoint, it was a masterpiece of strategic negotiation that transformed potential destructive conflict into profitable cooperation. From law enforcement perspective, it represented troubling evolution in organized crime that made traditional investigative approaches less effective. From community perspective, it was a complex mixture of reduced street violence and facilitated drug distribution, of pragmatic adaptation and moral compromise. From Bumpy Johnson's perspective, it was demonstration of the principle that had guided his entire criminal career: that intelligence and negotiation could achieve outcomes that violence alone couldn't, that adaptation to changing circumstances was essential for survival, and that power came not just from what you controlled directly, but from what you could coordinate among parties who wouldn't cooperate without your intervention. The alliance that shocked everyone in September 1952 became the model that defined drug distribution for a generation. Mexican cartels trying to take over Harlem's heroin trade had become partners rather than enemies, and that partnership generated wealth for everyone involved, while fundamentally transforming how organized crime functioned in America's largest city. The shock wasn't just that Bumpy had made the deal. The shock was that the deal worked better than anyone expected, and kept working long after the people who created it were gone.